There's a Christian parable told in sermons and sent in emails in an effort to encourage people to accept the alleged sacrifice of Jesus. It's called Don't Leave It on the Desk. If you'd rather hear it in its entirety than hear me briefly summarize it, I've provided a link below. Basically, the story involves a devout Christian student named Steve taking an Intro to Christianity class. Steve is highly studious and athletic. At the end of the class, he's the only one with the perfect grade and perfect attendance, so the professor brings a big box of donuts on the final day of class and offers each student a donut individually. As each student accepts, the professor requires Steve to do 10 push-ups on their behalves. As Steve begins to tire and the students begin to detect the unfairness of the event, they begin to react accordingly. One asks if he can do his own push-ups to earn his donut, and the professor, in his divine douchiness, says, no, Steve has to do them. He decided that if he can't earn his own damn donut, then he doesn't want one, and the professor requests that Steve do 10 push-ups for the donut that guy doesn't want. And he places it on the desk, telling him that if he doesn't want the donut Steve did those push-ups for, then he can just leave it on the desk. The story goes on and on until Steve is exhausted and most of the class feels highly guilty about the entire situation, because whether they eat a donut or not, Steve's going to have to suffer for them. In the end, it's revealed that it's an allegory for the alleged sacrifice of Jesus, and the point is that Jesus had to suffer for us, whether we knew him and wanted him to do so or not, so we might as well accept the gift, lest we have suffered in vain. There's a lot wrong with this little story, but this is exactly the kind of thing that people who are already believers of the Jesus story will gobble up. They'll get misty-eyed, inspired, and grateful rather than see this for the horror story that it is. For starters, it's illogical to require a perfect person to pay for someone else's imperfections. It seems that outside of the concept of paying for the mistake of sin, which all humans are born with no matter what, according to Christianity, this is never the case. By that logic, if I crash my car into someone else's car, I can't rightfully pay for the damages because I was the one who made the mistake, and the only person who could possibly pay for the damages would have to be someone with an infinite amount of money and a flawless driving record. There's never an explanation for this faulty logic, and it's just assumed to be valid. Wouldn't the heaven-hell salvation scenario make a lot more sense if punishments were ascribed to those who committed the actual transgressions, and for those punishments to be proportional in quantity and severity of the violations committed? Wouldn't it make more sense for my alleged soul to go up to St. Peter, who would calculate my sins, and then send me to hell for however long I was deemed to deserve, before spending the rest of my eternity in paradise, or even in mediocrity to pay for my mistakes in a way that would make sense? The next problem with this analogy itself is that Steve was a mortal student, just like everybody else. In the story of Jesus, the one making the sacrifice was the human form of an omnipotent God who was capable of miracles and who, after dying, was resurrected, making it more of an inconvenience than a real sacrifice. An immortal, omnipotent God whose human form dies just as a formality for the sake of the experience would be as inconvenient as Steve effortlessly performing a few push-ups, then having a team of gorgeous massage therapists sensually rub the stress from his arms. The story is intended to make us feel bad about turning our backs on the fruits of Jesus' pseudo-sacrifice, because he endured suffering that he didn't deserve, whether we accepted the gift or not, so why let it go to waste? Here's my stance, though. If I were in that classroom, donuts were my favorite food, and I hadn't eaten for a week straight, you still couldn't pay me to eat that donut. I'd refuse that indulgence on principle, because I'd refuse to take pleasure while my colleague unjustly, illogically, and painfully suffered on my behalf, when I didn't even ask him to. In fact, I'd ask Steve not to suffer on my behalf and tell the professor to fuck off because his demented scripture-based methods for reward for a devoted student didn't quite jive with the morality I've developed as a secular humanist. I would help Steve off the floor, tell the professor he could give me whatever grade he felt like, and slam the door on my way out. And as for that petty little prize my fellow student was meant to suffer for, I can guarantee you I'd leave it on the desk.